The cantina on Nexus Station buzzed with the usual mix of traders, smugglers, and mercenaries from across the galaxy. The air recyclers struggled against the thick atmosphere of various alien species, creating a hazy fog that danced around the dim lighting. In one corner booth, a crowd had gathered around a particularly boastful figure. Zethkar was a sight to behold, even by galactic standards. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, his reptilian frame was covered in scars that told stories of countless hunts. His species, the Vorthak, had evolved from apex predators on their homeworld of Scarthul, and Zethkar wore that heritage like a badge of honor. His 4 arms gestured wildly as he regaled his audience with tales of his latest expedition. "And then," Zethkar hissed, his forked tongue flicking out as he spoke, "the Krenth beast charged at me with all 6 of its legs pumping like hydraulic pistons. Each step shook the ground so hard that my equipment rattled in my pack. The creature stood 4 meters at the shoulder, covered in natural armor plating that could deflect plasma bolts." His audience leaned in closer. Most were hardened spacers who had seen their share of dangerous worlds, but Zethkar's reputation preceded him. He was known throughout this sector as the most successful Deathworlder hunter alive. "The Krenth homeworld has gravity 3 times what most species can handle," he continued, taking a long drink from his mug. "The atmosphere is so thick with sulfur compounds that it would burn the lungs of any civilized being. But I tracked that beast for 7 standard days through terrain that would kill most hunters in hours." A Zelrani trader, her blue-scaled head cocked with interest, asked, "How did you bring it down? I heard Krenth have redundant nervous systems." Zethkar's eyes gleamed with pride. "Patience and superior tactics. I used the creature's own aggression against it. When it charged, I fired a neural disruptor directly into its primary brain housing. The beast dropped like a meteor, and I claimed another trophy for my collection." The crowd murmured appreciatively. Zethkar's trophy room was legendary among certain circles. He had specimens from over 40 different death worlds, each representing creatures that could easily kill beings from standard environment planets. "Tell them about the Void Stalkers from Nightmare's Edge," urged a grizzled Corvan pilot. Zethkar's expression grew even more smug. "Ah, yes, the Void Stalkers. They hunt in packs and can phase partially out of normal space-time. Most beings can't even see them coming until their claws are already through your chest. They evolved in a dimension where darkness is absolute and sound travels differently." He gestured with all 4 arms, describing the hunt. "I spent 2 months developing specialized equipment just to track them. Phase detection sensors, reality anchors, quantum disruption fields. When I finally cornered a pack of 6, they thought their dimensional tricks would save them. They were wrong." The crowd was hanging on every word. This was exactly the kind of story that made Zethkar's reputation grow. In a galaxy where most civilized species came from worlds with moderate climates and reasonable gravity, someone who could successfully hunt the apex predators of death worlds was considered almost mythical. "The stalkers tried to phase out when I opened fire," he continued, "but my reality anchors kept them locked in normal space. Without their primary advantage, they were just oversized ambush predators. I claimed 3 specimens that day." A Felnari merchant shook her head in amazement. "I've seen the documentaries about Deathworlders. The survival statistics for expeditions to those planets are terrifying. How do you manage the environmental hazards alone?" "Superior equipment and superior genetics," Zethkar replied, flexing his muscles. "The Vorthak evolved on a world with crushing gravity and predators that would make your nightmares seem pleasant. We are natural hunters, with reflexes honed by millions of years of evolution. What challenges other species present merely interesting puzzles for me to solve." The conversation continued for another hour, with Zethkar describing hunts on worlds where the rain was acid, where the plants were carnivorous, and where gravity fluctuations could crush an unprepared visitor. Each story was more impressive than the last, and his audience grew as word spread through the cantina. It was during his description of hunting crystalline creatures on a world where the ground was made of razor-sharp mineral formations that a new voice cut through his narrative. "Impressive collection," the voice said quietly. But somehow it carried clearly over the ambient noise of the cantina. The crowd turned to see the speaker, and several beings stepped back in surprise. Standing at the edge of the group was a human female, though most of the aliens present would have simply identified her as representing one of the newer species to join galactic civilization. She was unremarkable by galactic standards, standing barely 1.5 meters tall. Her build was lean but not particularly muscular compared to the various predator species present. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a simple style, and her clothing was standard spacer gear. Nothing fancy or intimidating. What was unusual was her expression, which seemed oddly amused. "I am sorry. Did I interrupt?" she asked politely, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly sorry at all. Zethkar's 4 eyes fixed on her with curiosity rather than hostility. Humans were still relatively unknown quantities in this part of the galaxy. "Not at all. I was merely sharing some experiences with fellow hunters and traders. And you are?" "Sarah Chen," she replied simply. "I couldn't help but overhear your stories. You've certainly traveled to some fascinating places." The crowd began to murmur among themselves. Humans were known to be from a death world themselves, but their small stature and apparent fragility made that classification seem more like an administrative error than a reflection of their actual capabilities. Zethkar studied her with the calculating gaze of an experienced predator. "You sound skeptical of my achievements. Have you ever hunted Deathworlders yourself, little human?" Sarah's smile widened slightly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I've had some experience with dangerous creatures. Your collection is certainly impressive. 40 different death worlds, you said?" 43, to be precise, Zethkar corrected with obvious pride, each hunt more challenging than the last. "I have trophies from worlds that would kill most beings just by setting foot on the surface." "Fascinating," Sarah said, and she genuinely seemed interested. "Tell me, in all of your hunts across these death worlds, did any of them ever hunt you back?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and the casual conversation around them gradually died away as more beings tuned in to the exchange. There was something in the way the human had asked the question that suggested it was more than idle curiosity. Zethkar's expression shifted slightly. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." Sarah's posture remained relaxed, almost casual, but several of the more experienced spacers in the crowd began to notice something that made them unconsciously step back. There was a quality to her stillness that reminded them of documentaries they'd seen about apex predators on various worlds. The kind of perfect, patient stillness that came just before an attack. "It's a simple question," she said conversationally. "In all of your hunting expeditions, have you ever been the one being hunted? Have you ever been the prey instead of the predator?" Zethkar straightened to his full height, which was impressive even by Vorthak standards. His forearms crossed in a gesture that was clearly defensive, despite his attempt to appear confident. "I am Vorthak. We are not prey animals. We are the hunters, always." "Of course," Sarah nodded agreeably. "I wasn't questioning your species' capabilities. I was just curious about your personal experiences. It's just that, where I come from, the most dangerous hunters are usually the ones that learned how to hunt by being hunted first." The crowd was completely silent now. Several beings were looking between the tiny human and the massive Vorthak with growing unease. The dynamic of the conversation had shifted in a way that most of them couldn't quite identify, but that triggered ancient instincts about predator-prey relationships. "Where exactly do you come from?" Zethkar asked, his voice carrying a note of wariness that hadn't been there before. "Earth," Sarah replied simply. Sol system. It's a little blue-green world about 40,000 light-years from here. Maybe you've heard of it? A few beings in the crowd exchanged glances. Earth was indeed classified as a death world, but its inhabitants seemed so innocuous that most considered it a mistake in the classification system. I've heard the name, Zethkar said carefully. Your world is supposed to be a death world, though looking at you, I find that classification questionable. Sarah's smile grew broader, and this time it did reach her eyes. Unfortunately for Zethkar, it was the kind of smile that would have been immediately recognizable to any Earth predator as a display of teeth rather than an expression of friendliness. Oh, the classification is quite accurate, she said in the same conversational tone. Earth is definitely what you would call a death world. Extreme weather patterns, active geology, aggressive flora and fauna, atmospheric composition that's toxic to most galactic species, gravity that's on the high end of habitable parameters. She paused, looking around at the crowd with apparent interest. But you know what makes Earth really special? It's not just the environment that's dangerous. See, on most death worlds, there's usually one apex predator species that dominates the ecosystem. But Earth? She shook her head with what appeared to be fond reminiscence. Earth has dozens of apex predators, and they're all competing with each other. We've got pack hunters, ambush predators, pursuit hunters, trap builders, venomous species, creatures that hunt by land, air, and sea. And they all evolved together, constantly adapting to counter each other's hunting strategies. The crowd was listening intently now, and Zethkar found himself genuinely curious, despite his growing unease. But surely your species found a safe niche? He asked. Some environment where you could avoid the predators? Sarah laughed, and it was a sound that made several beings in the crowd unconsciously check for exits. That's the really interesting part. Humans didn't find a safe niche. We didn't evolve defensive adaptations or hiding strategies or specialized environments. We didn't develop armor or poison or enhanced speed. She looked directly at Zethkar, and her expression became serious. We evolved to hunt everything else. Every single apex predator on our planet learned to be afraid of humans. We didn't just compete with the other predators. We became the dominant predator species by learning to outhunt everything that had previously been hunting us. The cantina had become so quiet that the hum of the station's life support system seemed loud. You see, Sarah continued, her voice still conversational but somehow more intense. Humans learned to hunt by first learning to survive being hunted. We spent hundreds of thousands of years as prey animals, developing every trick and strategy we could think of just to stay alive. And then we turned all of those survival strategies into hunting techniques. Zethkar was beginning to understand why the human's simple question had felt like a challenge. And what exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Sarah replied with that same unsettling smile. I'm simply observing that your hunting style seems very traditional. You track dangerous creatures. You use superior equipment and tactics to overcome them. You collect trophies. It's very impressive. She paused, and the pause stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. But I notice you mentioned that you spent months preparing for each hunt, developing specialized equipment, studying your targets. That's the approach of someone who hunts as a profession or a hobby. Her head tilted slightly, like a predator evaluating prey. I was just wondering if you'd ever experienced hunting as a survival necessity. The question crystallized something that had been bothering Zethkar since the conversation began. This small human was somehow making him feel like he was the one being evaluated, being measured, being studied. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced since his youth, when he'd been training under the old hunt masters on Scarthul. Are you challenging me? He asked directly. Sarah's expression remained pleasant and innocent. Oh, goodness, no, I wouldn't dream of it. I was just making conversation about hunting techniques. Professional curiosity, you could say. But the way she said it made it clear that her curiosity was very professional indeed, and that Zethkar was the subject being studied. The crowd began to sense that something significant was happening, though most couldn't quite identify what. The small human seemed completely relaxed and friendly, but there was an undercurrent to the conversation that suggested dangerous depths. Zethkar found himself in the unusual position of being uncertain how to proceed. His hunting instincts were telling him that the situation had become potentially threatening, but he couldn't identify any specific danger. The human was still smiling, still speaking in pleasant tones, still appearing completely harmless. But something about her presence had fundamentally changed the dynamic in the room, and every experienced predator in the cantina was beginning to feel like they were in the presence of something that operated by rules they didn't understand. The human called Sarah Chen continued to smile and wait for his response, and Zethkar realized that the most important hunt of his career might be about to begin. The only question was whether he would be the hunter or the prey. The tension in the cantina had thickened like atmosphere before a storm. Zethkar studied the human female with the focused attention he usually reserved for tracking dangerous prey, but nothing about her external appearance explained the predatory instincts she was triggering in everyone present. "Perhaps," Sarah said after letting the silence stretch, "I could share a story of my own. Nothing as exotic as your collection, of course, but it might illustrate what I mean about hunting versus being hunted." Before Zethkar could respond, she had somehow positioned herself so that she was no longer at the edge of the crowd, but had moved to a central position. No one had seen her move, but now the group had unconsciously formed a circle around her rather than around the Vorthak hunter. "When I was 12 years old," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the space, "my family took a camping trip to what we call the Canadian wilderness. That's a region on Earth with extreme seasonal temperature variations, dense forest coverage, and an ecosystem filled with large predators." Several beings in the crowd exchanged glances. The idea of taking children into dangerous predator territory seemed insane by most galactic standards. "The second night of our trip, I woke up to hear my father speaking in very quiet, very controlled tones to my mother. He was telling her that a large predator had been circling our camp for the past hour, a creature we call a brown bear." Sarah's expression remained conversational, but her eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if she were seeing something the others couldn't. "Now, brown bears on Earth can weigh up to 800 kilograms. They have claws that can tear through tree trunks, jaws powerful enough to crush bones, and they can run 60 kilometers per hour through dense forest. They're also highly intelligent, with complex social structures and problem-solving abilities." Zethkar found himself genuinely interested despite his wariness. "And your family's response was to retreat to safety?" "That's where it gets interesting," Sarah replied. "See, we couldn't retreat. We were 3 days' travel from the nearest settlement, and brown bears are excellent trackers. If we ran, it would have followed us, and running triggers a predator's chase response. We would have been pursued by an 800-kilogram apex predator through its own territory." The crowd was completely silent now. Even the ambient noise of the cantina seemed muted. "So my father made a decision that probably seems insane to most civilized species. Instead of running from the predator, he decided to confront it." Sarah's smile returned, but it was different now, carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "He woke up my older brother and me, and he explained very calmly that we were going to hunt the bear." A Zelrani trader's scales shifted from blue to pale white, a sign of extreme anxiety in her species. "You hunted an 800-kilogram predator? With children?" "Oh no," Sarah laughed, and the sound made several beings unconsciously step back. "We didn't hunt it in the way you might think. See, that's the difference between traditional hunting and survival hunting. Traditional hunting is about using superior tools and tactics to kill dangerous prey. Survival hunting is about understanding predator psychology so completely that you can turn a predator into prey without necessarily killing it. She began to pace slightly as she spoke, and her movements had a fluid quality that reminded several species present of the documentaries they'd seen about various predator species. My father spent 2 hours teaching my brother and me everything he knew about brown bear behavior, how they establish dominance, how they assess threats, how they make decisions about whether potential prey is worth the risk of injury. By dawn, we understood that bear better than it understood itself. Zethkar's 4 eyes were fixed on her with growing unease. And then? And then we went hunting, Sarah said simply, but not the way the bear expected to be hunted. See, most prey animals that brown bears encounter follow predictable patterns. They either run, hide, or try to defend themselves in place. All of those responses reinforce the bear's assumption that it's the predator in the situation. She stopped pacing and looked directly at Zethkar. But humans learned a long time ago that the most effective way to deal with a predator is to convince it that it's actually prey. The silence in the cantina was now so complete that Sarah's words seemed to echo despite the sound-dampening field effects. We didn't run from the bear. We didn't hide from it. Instead, we began systematically stalking it through its own territory. Every time it settled down to rest, we made sure it knew we were watching. Every time it tried to drink or feed, we appeared just at the edge of its vision. Every time it tried to establish a position of strength, we demonstrated that we could approach undetected. Sarah's voice had taken on a hypnotic quality, and her audience was hanging on every word. The bear was experiencing something completely outside its evolutionary programming. Instead of chasing prey, it was being pursued by creatures it couldn't understand. We were too small to be a physical threat, but we were displaying hunting behaviors that indicated we considered it to be our target. A Felnari merchant stammered, "But surely it would have eventually attacked you directly." "That's exactly what my father was counting on," Sarah replied. After 8 hours of psychological pressure, the bear did exactly what he predicted it would do. It charged us in a direct confrontation, believing that its size and natural weapons would end the conflict quickly. Zethkar leaned forward despite himself. This was exactly the kind of moment he understood when superior predators used physical dominance to claim victory. And that's when my father demonstrated why humans became the dominant predator species on Earth, Sarah continued. The bear charged, expecting to fight frightened prey animals. Instead, it found itself facing a coordinated pack of hunters who had been planning for exactly that moment for hours. Her smile had become something that would have been immediately recognizable to any Earth predator as a threat display. My father had spent those 8 hours not just teaching us about bear psychology, but positioning us exactly where we needed to be. When the bear charged, it found itself running directly into a trap that used its own momentum and aggression against it. My brother and I had positioned ourselves to drive it toward a location my father had prepared where the terrain would force it to slow down and expose its vulnerable areas. The crowd was listening with the fascination that civilized beings often showed when confronted with descriptions of barely controlled savagery. The bear found itself tangled in carefully positioned ropes, off balance on treacherous ground, and facing a human with a weapon designed specifically to penetrate its natural defenses. The whole encounter lasted less than 3 minutes, but it took 8 hours of psychological warfare to set up those 3 minutes. Sarah paused, letting the implications sink in. "And here's the most important part," she said, her voice becoming almost conversational again. "We didn't kill the bear. We didn't have to. Once it realized that it had been completely outmaneuvered by what it had assumed were small, harmless creatures, it lost all interest in treating us as potential prey. It left our territory and never returned." Zethkar was beginning to understand why the conversation had felt like a challenge from the beginning. "You turned a predator into prey without actually harming it." Exactly, Sarah nodded approvingly. That's what humans learned to do over hundreds of thousands of years. We didn't evolve to overpower predators with physical superiority. We evolved to understand predator psychology so completely that we could manipulate it. We learned to think like predators, to anticipate their moves, to turn their own instincts against them. She looked around at the crowd, and several beings found themselves avoiding direct eye contact. Every apex predator on Earth learned to be afraid of humans not because we were stronger or faster or had better natural weapons, but because we could predict their behavior better than they could predict ours. We became the most successful predators in Earth's ecosystem by becoming the most unpredictable prey. The implications of what she was saying began to dawn on the more intelligent members of the audience. Humans hadn't become apex predators through normal evolutionary processes. They had become apex predators by learning to defeat apex predators. "Your hunting style," Sarah said, looking directly at Zethkar, "is very impressive, but it's based on superiority of equipment and preparation. You study your targets, you develop specialized tools, you use your natural advantages to overcome their natural advantages. It's the approach of someone who hunts for sport or profession." Her expression became thoughtful, almost analytical. "But I'm curious about something. In all of your hunts across 43 death worlds, have you ever encountered a creature that hunted the way humans hunt? Something that didn't rely on physical superiority or environmental advantage, but instead used psychological warfare and behavioral manipulation?" Zethkar found himself genuinely unsettled by the question. No. Most predator species follow predictable patterns based on their evolutionary advantages." "Of course they do," Sarah agreed. "That's what makes them predictable. And predictable predators are easy to turn into prey, once you understand their programming." The conversation had taken a turn that was making everyone in the cantina uncomfortable, though few could explain exactly why. The human was still speaking in pleasant conversational tones, but there was an undertone that suggested depths of predatory knowledge that went beyond anything they had previously encountered. "Let me ask you a different question," Sarah said, her tone still friendly but somehow more focused. "In your experience, what makes a successful hunter?" Zethkar straightened, relieved to be on more familiar ground. "Superior weapons, detailed knowledge of the target's weaknesses, patience, and the ability to capitalize on mistakes." "All excellent points," Sarah nodded. "Those are the fundamentals of traditional hunting. But human hunting evolved differently because we started as prey animals. We had to learn not just how to hunt, but how to survive being hunted while we were learning to hunt." She began pacing again, and her movements had become even more predator-like. "So humans develop techniques that aren't found in any other species. We learn to hunt by becoming better at being hunted than our predators were at hunting us." The crowd was completely absorbed in her explanation, even as they became increasingly uncomfortable with its implications. "For example," she continued, "humans learn to track predators not by following their trail, but by predicting where they would go next. We learn to set traps not by creating physical barriers, but by manipulating predator psychology to make them trap themselves. We learn to use tools not just as weapons, but as ways to extend our sensory capabilities and multiply our tactical options." Zethkar was finding the discussion fascinating, despite his growing unease. And this made humans more effective hunters than species that evolved as natural predators? "Not more effective," Sarah corrected. "Different. See, natural predators like yourself are optimized for hunting within their ecological niche. You're incredibly effective against creatures that follow normal predator-prey relationships. But humans learned to hunt by breaking those relationships, by operating outside the normal rules that govern predator behavior." She stopped pacing and looked directly at him again. "Which brings me back to my original question. Have you ever been hunted by something that didn't follow the normal rules? The question hung in the air, and Zethkar realized that the human had somehow turned their entire conversation into a demonstration of exactly the kind of psychological manipulation she had been describing. She had spent the last hour systematically probing his assumptions, challenging his worldview, and positioning herself as something outside his normal understanding of predator-prey relationships. And he was just beginning to realize that the hunt she had been talking about might already have begun. The human called Sarah Chen smiled at him, with what he was now certain was a predator's expression, and waited for his answer to a question that they both knew was far more than academic curiosity. Around them, the cantina had become a theater for a confrontation between two completely different approaches to predation, and everyone present was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic civilization. The most successful Deathworld hunter in known space was about to discover what it felt like to be prey. The silence stretched between Sarah and Zethkar like a held breath. Around them, the cantina had become an arena where two fundamentally different apex predators were evaluating each other across an evolutionary gulf that neither had previously imagined. Zethkar's four hands had unconsciously positioned themselves near his various weapons, not in preparation for immediate violence, but as an automatic response to feeling threatened by something he couldn't clearly identify. His hunting instincts were screaming warnings, but every rational part of his mind insisted that the small human female posed no physical danger. "You're studying me," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of realization that made several beings in the crowd shift nervously. "Yes," Sarah replied simply, making no attempt to deny it. "I have been since you started telling your hunting stories. It's a habit humans develop when we encounter new predator species." She tilted her head slightly, and the gesture reminded Zethkar uncomfortably of the way certain bird-of-prey species evaluated potential targets. "You have excellent reflexes, superior physical capabilities, and you've clearly mastered traditional hunting techniques. Your species evolved well for the role of apex predator." The compliment somehow felt more threatening than an insult would have. "But there's something I noticed while you were describing your hunts," she continued conversationally. "Every story you told followed the same basic pattern. You identified dangerous prey, you spent time developing superior equipment and tactics, you tracked the creature to a location where you held the advantage, and then you used your preparation and physical superiority to achieve victory." Zethkar found himself nodding despite his unease. "That is the essence of successful hunting." "It's the essence of successful traditional hunting," Sarah corrected gently. "But it's also completely predictable. Every hunt you described could have been anticipated by anyone who understood your species' psychology and hunting methodology." The crowd was watching the exchange with the fascination that civilized beings showed when observing barely controlled predatory displays. Several had begun recording the conversation, sensing that they were witnessing something that would become legend in spacer bars across the galaxy. "Are you suggesting that my hunting style is flawed?" Zethkar asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Not flawed," Sarah replied, apparently unaffected by his implied threat. "Just limited. You hunt like someone who has never had to worry about being hunted by something smarter than yourself." She stepped closer, and despite her small size, several beings in the crowd felt an urge to get out of her path. "Would you like me to demonstrate the difference?" The challenge was finally explicit, hanging in the air between them like the scent of blood in water. Zethkar felt his muscles tense as ancient predatory instincts prepared him for confrontation. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked carefully. Sarah's smile widened, showing teeth that seemed somehow more prominent than they had moments before. "A hunt, traditional rules. You can choose the location, the time frame, any equipment you consider appropriate. The only restriction is that neither of us can cause permanent harm to the other." The crowd began murmuring excitedly. The idea of witnessing a hunt between two apex predator species was unprecedented in galactic civilization. "And what would be the objective?" Zethkar asked, his professional curiosity warring with his instincts. "Simple," Sarah replied. "The first one to successfully stalk and physically tag the other wins. It's a variation on training exercises humans use to develop our hunting skills." Zethkar considered the proposal. By any rational measure, it should be an easy victory. He was larger, stronger, faster, better armed, and more experienced. The human was offering to compete with him in exactly the area where his species excelled. "Very well," he said finally. "I accept your challenge. But I choose the location and conditions." "Of course," Sarah agreed readily. "It's your hunt." Zethkar's confidence began to return. This was familiar territory, the kind of tactical planning that had made him legendary among Deathworld hunters. The abandoned mining complex in Sector 7. "It's been empty for decades, so there won't be any civilian interference. Multiple levels, complex terrain, various environmental hazards. We each start from opposite ends of the complex and work toward the center." Several beings in the crowd began placing bets, though the odds heavily favored the experienced Vorthak hunter. "Perfect," Sarah said, seeming genuinely pleased with his choice. "How much time do you want for preparation?" Zethkar studied her carefully, looking for any sign of uncertainty or false confidence. He found nothing but calm anticipation, which was somehow more unsettling than bravado would have been. 2 hours, he decided. Enough time to gather equipment and survey the approach routes. "Excellent," Sarah nodded. "And just to be clear on the rules, we're each trying to physically tag the other without causing permanent injury. First successful tag wins. No weapons that could cause serious harm, no sabotaging life support systems, no calling for outside assistance." "Agreed," Zethkar said, extending one of his massive hands. Sarah shook it with her much smaller hand, and he noticed that her grip was stronger than her size would suggest, with calluses that spoke of extensive physical training. As the crowd began to disperse, making arrangements to witness the hunt, Zethkar found himself studying the human with renewed interest. Now that the challenge was explicit, he could observe her with the calculating analysis he used for any hunting situation. What he saw was troubling. Sarah moved through the crowd with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in her own body. Her eyes constantly scanned the environment, tracking movement and assessing potential threats or opportunities. Her posture suggested someone who had extensive experience with physical confrontation, despite her unimposing size. Most concerning was her apparent lack of concern about facing a creature 3 times her size with natural weapons that could easily kill her. Either she was overconfident to the point of stupidity, or she knew something he didn't. 2 hours later, Zethkar stood at the designated entrance to the abandoned mining complex, fully equipped for what should be a straightforward tracking exercise. He wore his personal armor, carried non-lethal stunning devices, and had brought every piece of detection equipment he owned. The mining complex was perfect hunting territory for someone with his abilities. Multiple levels connected by maintenance shafts, numerous blind corners and ambush points, and environmental hazards that would favor someone with superior physical capabilities and technical equipment. He activated his motion detectors, thermal scanners, and acoustic pickup devices. Within minutes, he had identified Sarah's position near the opposite entrance and began tracking her movement through the complex. What he found was puzzling. Instead of moving toward the center of the complex as he had expected, she seemed to be taking a circuitous route through some of the most dangerous areas. Her path led through sections where the artificial gravity was unstable, past areas where toxic gases had accumulated from decades of industrial decay, and into regions where the structural integrity was questionable. Zethkar began pursuing her, confident that his superior equipment and tracking skills would allow him to close the distance quickly. He moved through the complex with the patience and precision that had made him famous, using every technique he had developed over decades of hunting dangerous prey. But as the hunt progressed, he began to notice something disturbing. Every time he thought he had pinned down her location, his sensors would show her somewhere else entirely. She seemed to be moving through the complex in ways that defied his understanding of the terrain. After an hour of pursuit, he realized that his thermal scanners were picking up heat signatures in areas where she couldn't possibly be. His motion detectors were triggering false alarms with increasing frequency. His acoustic sensors were registering sounds that suggested she was moving through areas that his schematics showed were inaccessible. It was then that a terrible possibility occurred to him. Instead of being the hunter tracking his prey, he might be the prey being led through a carefully planned route by a predator who understood the complex better than he did. The realization came too late. The lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting eerie shadows throughout the complex. Zethkar activated his night vision equipment, but found that it was picking up infrared signatures everywhere, as if the human had somehow flooded the area with heat sources. His motion detectors were now useless, triggering constantly as small objects moved through the air around him. His acoustic sensors were being overwhelmed by a symphony of sounds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And somewhere in the chaos, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. Laughter. Not the laughter of someone enjoying a game, but the laughter of a predator that had successfully trapped its prey. Zethkar. Sarah's voice came from somewhere nearby, though his sensors couldn't pinpoint the source. Do you know what the difference is between hunting for trophies and hunting for survival? He spun around, weapons ready, but saw nothing but shadows and false heat signatures. When you hunt for trophies, her voice continued, seeming to come from a different direction now, you can take your time, use your advantages, and control the engagement. But when you hunt for survival, you have to assume that your prey is smarter than you, better prepared than you, and has capabilities you don't understand. Zethkar realized that everything in the complex had been prepared in advance. She hadn't been wandering aimlessly through dangerous areas. She had been setting up a hunting ground where his advantages became disadvantages. You spent 2 hours preparing your equipment, Sarah's voice said, now seeming to come from above him. I spent 2 hours turning this place into a giant trap. He fired a stunning blast in the direction of her voice, but hit nothing. The energy discharge lit up the area for a brief moment, revealing that he was surrounded by carefully positioned mirrors and heat sources that had been creating false sensor readings. The difference between human hunting and traditional predator hunting, Sarah continued, her voice now coming from behind him, is that humans learned to hunt things that were better than them at everything else. We had to become better at preparation, better at understanding psychology, better at turning environments into weapons. Zethkar spun again, but she was no longer there, or had never been there. He was beginning to lose track of which sensor readings were real and which were deceptions. We learned to hunt by first learning to escape from creatures exactly like you, she said, and this time her voice was very close indeed. He felt something touch his shoulder, light as a feather but unmistakable. The tag. The emergency lighting flickered back to full illumination, and Sarah stepped into view from what he could now see was an obvious hiding spot that his sensors had somehow failed to detect. She was completely unharmed, not even breathing hard, and she was holding the small electronic tag that indicated her victory. How? Was all Zethkar could manage to say. Humans have been hunted by creatures like you for millions of years, Sarah replied, her voice gentle but carrying undertones that spoke of depths of predatory knowledge that Zethkar was only beginning to understand. We learned to survive by becoming better at being prey than you are at being predators. She gestured around at the complex, which Zethkar now realized had been systematically modified to neutralize every advantage he possessed. You spent your preparation time gathering better weapons. I spent mine learning everything about you, your equipment, your tactics, your psychology, your probable responses to various stimuli. The full scope of what had happened began to dawn on him. You turned me into prey. I turned the situation into one where your evolutionary advantages became disadvantages, Sarah corrected. That's what humans learned to do when we were being hunted by creatures that were bigger, stronger, faster, and better armed than us. She smiled that predator's smile again. The difference is that we learned to win by making sure the hunt happened on our terms, using rules that we understood better than our opponents. Zethkar looked around at the complex with new understanding. Every area she had led him through had been prepared to create false sensor readings, misdirect his tracking attempts, and funnel him toward a position where she held every advantage. This wasn't a hunt, he realized. This was a demonstration. This was exactly the kind of hunt humans engage in every day on Earth, Sarah replied. The kind where you assume your opponent is better than you at everything, so you have to win by being more prepared, more adaptable, and better at psychological warfare. The implications were staggering. Humans had evolved not just to be effective predators, but to be effective predators specifically against other effective predators. As they made their way back to the cantina, where the crowd was waiting eagerly to hear the results, Zethkar found himself fundamentally reconsidering everything he thought he knew about predator-prey relationships. So when you asked if any of them had ever hunted me back, he said slowly, you already knew the answer. I knew that you hunted like someone who had never had to worry about being hunted by something smarter than yourself, Sarah replied. That's the difference between evolving as a natural apex predator and evolving as a prey species that learned to hunt apex predators. They walked in silence for a while before Zethkar asked the question that had been bothering him since the beginning. What kind of death world produces a species that learns to hunt by being hunted? Sarah's smile returned, carrying depths of predatory satisfaction that spoke of evolutionary pressures beyond anything Zethkar had previously imagined. The kind where everything wants to kill you, she said simply. And you learn that the best defense is to become better at hunting than anything else is at being a predator. As they entered the cantina to face the crowd's questions, Zethkar realized that his reputation as the galaxy's most successful Death World hunter was about to undergo a fundamental revision. He also realized that he was very glad humans were apparently friendly.